thinking that perhaps a slightly different way to approaching this end session would be to ask two of our scholars who have come from afar, who are in the broader areas of what would be considered critical university studies, or at least studies that have tried to grapple with the ways in which to dismantle aspects of the current academy, to use the space to reflect on the past 2 days and to consolidate some or distillate some of the central issues. And so we've asked Shirley and Tate and Michalinos, Zembylas to do that for us. Thank you.
Okay. Can you hear me? Good. Thank you, Dina. I won't even try to summarize any of the conversations in the past 2 days. I wouldn't dare. Let me start by saying that I really enjoyed the conversations. I've learned a lot. I need to process many of the ideas. But I want to start. I was reading these past few days 2 articles on Ibram Kendi's new book, How to Be an Anti-Racist. And the point that he makes there, and I'll use this to make my point later, he says, why not being racist is not enough. You have to be anti-racist. So there is no middle ground like non-racist. Like Trump said the other day, I'm the least racist person in the world. He says, that's nonsense. There's only 2 categories here. So that might be an example because we have been blasting polarities, and maybe that's one example that this is one polarity that we may hold on. There is racism and anti-racism. There is no middle ground. And you have to choose sides. So that's his point. So I would also argue, why not decolonial work or even critical work is not enough? Because they can be co-opted too. And I think there have been several discussions about these concerns in the past 2 days. So my point is, it's not enough to be decolonial or critical. We have to be anti-colonial. So the question is, how to be an anti-colonial university in structures that are, by definition, colonial? What does an anti-colonial university look like? So I think several of the conversations in the past 2 days, I think, pointed out to some ideas how to identify colonial practices and colonial policies and challenge them. So this is an important task. And it's not always easy to identify those because they have been so much ingrained in the structures of the university that there has to be theoretical work as well as political work to identify those colonial practices and then start the work of dismantling them or challenging them. So for me, critical university studies, to go to the meat of the conversation, because this is about critical university studies, is not a field of study. It's an intellectual and political project. But deeply, it's an anti-colonial project. So if you want to be doing critical university studies, from my understanding in the past 2 days, you cannot avoid but defining it as deeply anti-colonial. With many possible trajectories. So there have been different ideas. There is not only one way of doing critical university studies. There are different political and other settings in the universities that we work for, in the global north, in the global south. Even global north and global south sound like totalizing categories, and you have to unpack those as well. So each setting has to be looked at in a different way, and definitely we can learn from each other. So the difficulties that have been brought up, as Crane said earlier, are part of the process, are part of this project. You cannot avoid but face those difficulties. And you have to, we have to develop ways of doing things differently. Because we have developed the habit of doing things in particular ways and not questioning those practices. And I think it's an important part of this process, which is an unending process, in a sense. There is no beginning. Maybe there has been a beginning, but it's an ongoing. So I don't think there is a moment that we can say, now the project is ended and we have been decolonized, or this is the end of colonialism. Coloniality is very much a process, so the fight against coloniality is an ongoing process. And there are different manifestations and tools. So what we are asking is to find and learn from each other how those tools that are both theoretical and political, and deeply, for me, they're also deeply ethical as well, to find openings for counter practices at the university. So that's for now.
Thank you, Michalinos. I really agree with everything you've said. I want to add in something to that, though, and that's to thinking about what we're attached to and what we disalienate from. One of the things that I think we've been speaking about today a lot is attachments to white supremacy, and how it is that as Black people within this continent and beyond this continent, as people in the African diaspora as well, in which I place myself, we continue to be suited to white supremacy, often in ways that we're not even conscious of. It's kind of like a reflex action, right? So the reflex action is still one in which we see things from Africa that we see as African as in some way inferior. How do we get out of that particular mindset? Because that goes to what Michalinos was saying about the way in which coloniality continues to work within our university systems, often in very subterranean ways. We attach ourselves to knowledge systems in which we are reproduced in negative ways as people from the continent or people from the African diaspora. We also put ourselves within assessment systems in which we're always going to fail and be found to be wanting, and we impose that on our students and also on our junior faculty, for example, in terms of how we assess people. When we read things as well, we read them from particular perspectives that we never think about. They come from somewhere. They come from our disciplines a lot, as I know, but also from our own political investments in keeping certain things going. So I think for me, I've always, maybe I've begun to think about it more and more. What do we need to give up in order to create this university that we want to have? Black feminists have been speaking about what we need to do to the categories that are there within white feminism, those cherished categories that we have to give up, give over to intense critique in order to move forward politically as Black women, right, Black feminists. In a similar way, what relationships to theory do we have to give up? What relationships to management do we have to give up? What relationships to whiteness do we have to give up? And this morning, I think it was Sue that said something about we have to give up our privilege. I think that that is really important, but it is also something that we as black academics need to think about. Because what we form as black academics within our countries and in our communities are elites. We are part of the elite. We cannot get away from that. But it's about how we occupy that position. How do we occupy it? What do we do with it? I'm very grateful to my colleague and dear friend, my grandson, Jason. He's not my grandson, he's just a figure of speech. Right? Yeah. For saying about me in the bus coming from the airport that what he values about me as an academic is that I don't pull the drawbridge up after me. Right? I'm grateful to you for saying that, because it's certainly something that I think is very important. We are privileged. We've been given this gift of being able to be in the academy, being able to change the world, we think, or at least change the mindsets of some of our students, but also change the futures of many of our students as well. So for me, it's important for us to see ourselves as not just this person that occupies that status position that I'm never going to give up. What are you going to do with it? That's the challenge. What will you do as that head of department who can employ a very suitably qualified black woman instead of the less qualified white man? What would you do? You employ the person best suited for the job. The black woman should get the job in that case. You know, we have to see what we do as political. Nothing that we do is apolitical. Everything we do is political, including what we put in our reading lists. Right? Let's start from there. Our roles as teachers. We are engaged in a political activity. I mean, I know that within our institutions in the UK, my white colleagues never see themselves in that way. They never see themselves as engaged in any political activity, because to them, the disciplines are completely apolitical, they're completely objective, and this is what knowledge looks like. Well, no, my knowledge does not look like that, right? My knowledge does not say that all black people are criminals in the UK. My knowledge does not say that black kids are ineducable. My knowledge also does not say that black women, you know, are like drug addicts or, you know, people who live on welfare. My knowledge does not say that. So there's something quite defunct about your knowledge then. So it's about constant critique of the knowledge systems in which we are based as well, right? Because it's not just that white people have to give up this privilege. We also have to give up the privilege that we have as black elites of being able to hide behind knowledge systems that we are birthed into, you know, as we become sociologists or become psychologists, right? We have to give up this universal, Michael, I think, said that this universal thing, that this is what knowledge looks like, because it doesn't. I'm going to stop, sorry. I went on a bit long. Okay, we can go now, yeah? Okay, good.
Would anybody, should we open it up to the floor? We have a little bit of time now. Or any other reflections? Sorry, hands were put up and I actually saw nothing. Sorry, there we go. Jason.
Hi, thank you so much, Michalinos and Shirley, for your reflections. I just want to highlight this because I think it's a really, really important point, and it's not to embarrass Shirley any further, but in an English context, and I use a UK context, it is very, very common for senior black academics to pull up the ladder, and it's almost kind of situating this idea of a rite of passage. And I don't think I'd be exaggerating. I think maybe Shirley can concur with this. There are very few people at Shirley Ann's level that actually put that ladder down for black academics to kind of take up. And I think if there were many, if you brought, you know, a lot of black academics from my generation and they were here, you could do well to count on maybe 6 fingers how many people do it. And Shirley Ann would be one of those people. And it's a real shame. And I think there was a lot of talk yesterday in the book launch about, you know, there was a gentleman who asked a question in terms of black on me. He was really angry when he was saying it. He was really animated, but he was talking about kind of this black on black kind of violence. And it's kind of a really visceral thing. I think it's really important, you know, that idea that it's almost like a decolonizing, there has to be a decolonizing of the mind almost, because it's that idea that there's only room for one of us, and that within that white supremacist kind of dialogue, you kind of pit two bulls together and see which one comes out on top, and it's kind of really, one, it's really toxic, and two, is almost like in terms of, it's this idea of we're watering this kind of toxic soil, so we're all complicit in watering this toxic soil, and we kind of need to move away from that, you know, kind of get off that plantation and kind of rethink and re-examine that particular context, because, and I can only speak to a UK context, but from what I hear, it's the same kind of thing in America as well, and to all intents and purposes, from what I heard yesterday, the same thing happens here. So it's kind of really thinking about what we can all do to support one another, because it's in our best interest to have an inclusive academy that benefits everyone, and that is reflective of an ever-increasing diverse multicultural society.
Yeah, I thank the two speakers for this, and I specifically want to kind of look at the whole category of the apolitical and the so-called neutral, because I don't think there's anything called apolitical and neutral, and I think the more we come across these, we need to start suspecting these neutral, so-called neutral categories, because I think they in some way or the other represent or reflect the dominant ideologies and practices, and the whole power relationship needs to be then seen through that. And the other point, coming from the field of women's studies, whereby, I mean, I find a lot of parallels in the way that, you know, we've been discussing here. For example, from the point of view of India, I can say the whole universal category of the Indian women doesn't mean anything at this present juncture. Because if you say, compare the upper caste, middle class women with the Dalit women or the Muslim women, I think that they're, far apart. So the universality in that sense, of course, it doesn't work anymore, and hence, it's not just the ethical, it's not just the ethical, but also the political standpoint one has to take in terms of then looking at who are the women in the university leadership positions. So for example, in India, you have very equal ratios in terms of, say, students, I can say, because not much study has been done in terms of teachers. So you have equal parity in terms of the students, you know, who are in the higher education. But if you try to again deconstruct as to who the female students are, and from which caste, from which region, from which language, that's when the exact thing becomes clear as to how intersectionalities work across categories. So I think that's the point I wanted to make. Thank you.
Hi all. I think something that really came across quite strongly for me in today's discussions is how parallel to the project of decolonizing the mind is a decolonization of the body, right? Because I don't think we talk enough about how the body sort of works and functions as a site of political expression in and of itself, right? How the body sort of facilitates micro-political statements as well. How its regulation and deregulation impacts and influences power relations, and how that also then perpetuates unequal power relations. So I think that came across quite strongly today. And then parallel to the decolonization of the body was also for me a decolonization of the space. I think somehow, in some way, a lot of people were sort of referring or trying to allude to that. The importance of architecture and building structures in our universities and how they actually make alternative bodies invisible. And one thing that didn't come across today is disabled bodies, or rather we don't say disabled bodies anymore, right? We say people living with disabilities. That's how we talk about it now. So there wasn't a representation of that today, and I would have liked it if there was, and maybe next time we think about that, you know. And even with tomorrow's discussion, I always find it interesting how gender issues are always like placed last on the agenda. But yeah, so, and also then the language, right? How different categories of bodies, you know, and how we describe bodies also just represent, I think for me, different codes of power. I think that's something else that would have been interesting if we had touched on today. Yeah.
Thanks. I just wanted to pick up on the idea of us being able to do practical things alongside the very important big debates about the anti-colonial project, that there are real everyday things that we can do in our own little cracks and spaces. And I think sometimes I need to hang on to that when feeling a little overwhelmed, or when it feels like the structures are too big. And we've had quite a few examples, and I think it's useful to hold on to those. Things like, I mean, for me, a big issue is the way in which we do reviews. I think it's a huge power issue, the entire academic publishing process, an incredibly alienating space. I think those of us who have perhaps are in positions to be able to speak back to systems like the NRF, who when you're applying for rating ask, why are you always publishing with your students? You must just publish on your own. Things like, oh no, shame, he's DHET, not NRF. But systems like that, and also systems like showing your shadow CV. I really think it's important for those of us who have had any, when you don't get a grant and when you get a paper rejected, we need to be the ones who say that. We need to be the ones just to show vulnerability, because I think, I know it's a point I've made before, but I just think our spaces do not allow for, our universities don't allow for vulnerability. They don't allow for people to mess up, especially in a managerialist era where you're so terrified, you cover your tracks, you pretend you didn't do it wrong. And I think we need to have more and more spaces where we show that stuffing up is actually part of the education process.
Thank you.
Yeah, I like to thank everyone, and also Dina and Andre and the team for opening up this space and enabling this exchange. One question that kind of circulates in my head is from, I think it was the last panel when we were talking also about what it would be if the University of Ghana would have affiliation in London or in Berlin. And what it means when international or German students go to study to South Africa or to Trinidad, we have an exchange with Trinidad, or to Ghana, the kind of experience they make. But on the other side, how US models, British models, some German models, they're still struggling, they're trying to be part of it, actually export these universities without considering local knowledge, without considering that the canon is limited, naive and ignorant, and how this culture of ignorance is being established and goes on, I mean, even in 21st century. And I thought we had here such an intricate discussion about how we would imagine such a, I don't know, a University of Ghana in London. A very content-oriented, very much on the idea of how this knowledge production could look like, which is not happening in these capitalist universities, expanding, I mean, having extractivist projects in place and continuing on these projects. I'd just like it to share this.
My point is very much related to her point, because I find the exchange platforms very powerful. Normally, I send some undergraduates to King's College, and what has been running along their email on their way back, like the last lot came this Saturday, and they go immediately after they finish their 4th year, is that, like the last one was very interesting. This student wrote like, we realize that they are not more or less than us, you know? So the recognition that they have something to say, you know, the fear of arriving in King's College and you have students from Asia, from Canada, from US, it's really global, that program. And these students always come and feel very confident, and the ones that have gone on tend to be getting into the discourse of really decolonizing their mind. So I think well-structured exchange programs that talk about these discourses are very useful. They're a more powerful tool than a curriculum, a typical university curriculum.
just picking up the point that was raised about failures, and I think it is quite disciplinary, because if you look at the hard sciences, applied sciences, they celebrate failures. They write papers about failures. In social sciences and humanities, you can't say, hey, I went to the archive, I didn't find what I'm looking for. It's a complete mess. You know, there's no PhD thesis which has been published saying I failed in discovering what I started my original project with, and I completely changed it. So in a sense, it is disciplinary, that we don't celebrate. Even when we look at the research excellence framework, that I know Chris is gone now, but even in terms of research excellence, oh, Chris is there. That's one of the challenges we have. We don't celebrate failures.
Yes, please do.
Hi everyone. Sorry, I'm not wearing my name tag. Sipo. I just, because I was talking about this with Seppo during tea. Can I stand? Okay. Sorry. I was just talking to Seppo about this over tea. I mean, this is a question, and as the panel was speaking about the African University, this is a question that we sort of asked with Prof. Ratele in a paper, but specifically focusing on psychology and, you know, sort of trying to think of what do you mean when you say African this, right? What does this thing mean? And it's such a complicated thing, because one of the questions that I had in my head, and I know I said this to Sharon yesterday, one of my pet peeves is when I hear people use the word indigenous. And it feels to me like we don't really ask the question about what does this word mean when we say indigenous. And often, I was saying this to Tsepo, saying this to people, that often it's this almost this thing of the past, that you want to go retrieve something. You know, in South Africa, pre-1652, you want to retrieve whatever was there, and you can't retrieve it. And it's this difficulty of this wanting, and I guess I had heard Prof. Sudin differently, maybe I heard him with my psychologist's ears, when he speaks about this desiring for sort of whiteness, this idea of a desired object, right, versus an object of desire, right? And it's this thing of, well, an object of desire is this fantasy in your head of what this thing that will give you happiness, that gives you emancipation, what it is, versus a desired object, which is something that you can actually go out and get. And this was something for me always around the question of an African university, vis-a-vis, I guess, a university in Africa, which is basically what we had. And Mamdani, of course, already said this in the late 90s. But this question often about what does it mean to have an African university? And it feels as though sometimes when people raise indigenous, it closes off. Just you close off the discussion that this is the thing. Whereas actually you can't retrieve the past, therefore you are always, as Sharon says, you are always trying to recreate this African university. And it's so important because especially in psychology, at least that's a discipline that I'm most familiar with, this, what Chinua Achebe says about Africa, is the idea that Africa suffers from an image problem, you know? For me, the title of my PhD is Africa, and there's always this sort of pushback when I went to go interview people, and one of the things that they were most curious about was, what is this Africa that you are talking about? Which is funny, because that's the question that I was asking myself continuously in the PhD. What is Africa? What does it mean? And one of the things that I know, in one sense, it doesn't necessarily only mean this geography, this sort of location. It means something else. But opening up the space and not in one sense always limiting it to this idea of the indigenous, this idea that you can retrieve something in your past, which is if you think Freud, which is something that Freud would have probably argued is basic human nature, of wanting to correct the past always, instead of thinking about what you can do in the future. So I thought that would be something that was interesting for me.
We have Sue and then Chi.
Just reflecting on what Shirley Ann said about giving up that which is desired. And of course, this is a tremendous struggle within oneself as to whether you should continue to argue or just give up. And picking back up on something Sharon said earlier this morning about the uncoerced rearrangement of desires. Yeah, and how do we go from the giving up that's desired to the uncoerced rearrangement of desires? And for me, that raises a very difficult question, which I would consider to be a properly educational question. And that is the question of making ourselves and our students and others able to question what is desirable, what desires are desirable, and to question the desirability of our desires. And that is really the thing that is at the heart of education, because education is about giving people real choices to make the future different from the present that they already know. And in order to make it different, or at least even to make different mistakes, we need to have, it's so complicated, isn't it? To give up what is desired, to rearrange them but not to be forced to, and to think about whether the desires are even desirable in the first place. So it's just a reflection, and it's, I'm just sharing it, but I don't know what one does with that, really.
Chief, can we ask you to end this for us?
Okay. That's daunting. The government should close it. There's a colleague at the NRF, Dr. Kobela, when he sees us, he says government. He comes from government. Yeah, thanks. I was, past 2 days, more enjoying to listen than to make a contribution verbally. And this goes back to what I said when we were introducing ourselves yesterday, that for me, this is my expectation, basically, as I had said when I introduced myself. The expectation is, what is it that I think I'm going to be getting here that is going to support me with my work back in the department now, because we're working on defining institutions in terms of the policy. But I seem to be getting more than that. If, for instance, we try and define the meaning of African in an African university, it's an angle that I didn't even think of when we were thinking about legislation and policy in the department, because we tend to be focused narrowly on South Africa. And yes, we do have those aspirations of operating in collaboration with the institutions in the rest of the continent. We want to reflect ourselves as well, South Africans as Africans, whichever way you want to look at that. So I am really, this discussion, I even forgot it's Friday afternoon, the way these discussions are so heavy, really heavy, and you kind of absorb and absorb and absorb. So well done to the colleagues who have put this together, and also the choice of topics and the speakers who are making contributions to this. I think the fact that people are not sipping or puffing and passing, it's actually because of that, because the topics are, the discussions are absorbing, and it invokes something on colleagues in making this contribution. So I think people who are going to come tomorrow and the next 2 days, Monday and Tuesday, have got a huge challenge to keep up with the pace and the standard that has been set in the past 2 days. Yes, I think I would just like to put it like that on my side. And I don't think this is a reflection of only me, because it relates to something that I'm working on in the department, but I suspect it relates to all of us in different ways. I'm emphasizing department. There's a side that I'm not saying here, and that is the side of being a student. Of reading and studying and about this, and I'm making a difference between reading and studying deliberately, because, you study with or read with a purpose of writing something when it comes to transformation of higher education in South Africa. Especially the colleague who also from Kenya, who Amos mentioned the context of American university in Africa and the discussion that ensued afterwards, if we can have, if we would have an African university in Europe or in America, what then would that do and so on. And all those perspectives, again, they add something into what one is thinking about, not only in terms of work now, but also in terms of my own studies. So thank you very much, colleagues. Much appreciated.
Thank you so much. Oh, and thank you so much to the crochet team. If everyone can now proceed, and the coach is waiting for us outside. Thank you.